The silence of the ocularis nexus was never absolute. It was a layered thing, woven from the distant thrum of fusion reactors, the hiss of recycled oxygen, and the soft, polyphonic murmurs of 46 different species trying to convince themselves they weren't one misunderstanding away from extinction. But when the iris door of the sanctuary hall slid open, the silence changed. It became heavy, brittle, and cold. Elias Thorne felt the atmospheric pressure drop in the back of his throat. He didn't look up from the porcelain cup cradled in his palms. He didn't need to. The frantic skittering of the Valthari trade delegation, their multiple limbs clicking against the carbon fiber floor as they beat a hasty retreat, told him everything he needed to know. The low-frequency hum of the Xylith hive mind, usually a constant background radiation of thought, cut off as if severed by a blade. Within 10 seconds, the room, a space designed for the soft-spoken whispers of diplomacy, was empty, except for him. Elias took a slow, measured breath. The steam from the tea carried the scent of dried jasmine and something bitter, a terrestrial reminder of a world he hadn't seen in over 15 years. He watched the surface of the amber liquid. A tiny ripple appeared, then another, rhythmic and heavy. She was inside. Verazul moved with a grace that felt like an insult to physics. Her phase shift armor was a matte obsidian, currently miming the shadows of the vaulted ceiling, making her look like a tear in the fabric of reality. She was a Xandari apex, a biological masterpiece forged on a high-gravity world where the weak didn't just die, they were erased. Her presence was a physical weight, a predatory aura that triggered the amygdala of every sentient being within 50 meters. It was the predatory silence made flesh. Elias finally raised his gaze. She stood at the edge of the circular tea table, her height towering over his seated form. Her eyes were not eyes so much as burning apertures of violet light, flickering with the data stream of her synaptic resonator. She was scanning him. She was looking for the spike in cortisol, the dilation of pupils, the involuntary tremor in the hands that signaled a prey response. She found none. "You are still here, little ape," her voice vibrated, a deep, harmonic resonance that bypassed the ears and settled directly in the sternum. The translator on Elias's lapel struggled to catch the nuances, rendering it into a cold, metallic English. "I've always found that running makes my knees ache, Verazul," Elias replied. His voice was sandpaper on silk, quiet, weary, but steady. "And the tea is at the perfect temperature. It would be a crime against the harvest to let it go cold." The Xandari's head tilted, a sharp bird-like movement. Her armor shifted, the obsidian plates clicking into a defensive-aggressive configuration. "You recognize my designation. You know the protocols of the Nexus. When a Xandari enters a neutral zone, the lesser must yield the space. It is written in the Accords your species so desperately signed." "The Accords also mention hospitality," Elias countered. He reached for the second cup, untouched and steaming, and pushed it across the table toward the empty seat. "I made enough for two. It's a Terran blend, old earth chamomile with a hint of valerian root. It's supposed to be calming, though I suspect your metabolism would treat it like water." Verazul didn't move for 3 seconds. To a Xandari, 3 seconds was an eternity of tactical evaluation. She was assessing whether his lack of fear was a sign of extreme competence, mental instability, or a trap. "You do not smell of fear," she stated, her violet eyes narrowing. "You smell of ash and old rain." Elias smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "That's the most poetic description of a midlife crisis I've ever heard. Sit or don't. But if you're going to kill me, do it before the jasmine notes fade. I'd hate to die with a bad taste in my mouth." With a sound like grinding stones, Verazul pulled the chair out. It was a delicate thing, built for the slender frames of the Lithans, but it held her weight as she descended into it. She sat with her back perfectly straight, her hands, long, clawed, and terrifyingly precise, resting on the table. "Why?" she asked. The word was stripped of its harmonic layers. It was a raw, biological question. "Because everyone else has already fled," Elias said, taking a sip of his tea. "And if everyone flees, no one learns anything. My people have a saying, better the devil you know than the one you don't. But I've always preferred better a conversation with a hunter than a monologue in an empty room. Varazul reached for the cup. Her movements were so fast they were almost a blur, yet the cup didn't rattle. She lifted it to where a nose might have been on a human, inhaling the vapor. "Your species is a paradox, Elias Thorne," she whispered. "You are fragile. Your lives are a blink in the cosmic eye. Your biology is inefficient. Yet you sit in the shadow of a sun killer and offer leaves and water." "We're a gritty lot," Elias said, using the old street slang of the Martian colonies. "We don't have the teeth you do, or the lifespan of the Valthari. So we make up for it with stubbornness and bad habits. Hospitality is just a habit that stuck." "Is that why the Nexus is failing?" Varazul asked, her eyes locking onto his. "Because of habits?" Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Xandari's aura. "You've noticed it too then. The glitches in the security feed, the sudden reassignments of the high overseers, the way the air feels like it's waiting for a spark." "I do not notice things, human. I track them," she corrected. "The Council is hiding something. A rot in the foundation of the Ocularis. My superiors think it is a resource dispute. I think it is something hungrier." Elias set his cup down. The porcelain made a sharp clack against the table. "They call it the Void Cell. I've seen the encrypted pings in the human diplomatic server. They aren't planning a war, Varazul. They're planning a harvest." The huntress went perfectly still. The obsidian plates of her armor pulsed with a dim, rhythmic light. For the first time in recorded history, a Xandari looked at a human not as a biological curiosity, but as an equal in a shared nightmare. "If what you say is true," she said, her voice dropping into a register so low it made the tea in the cups vibrate, "then we are both already dead. This station is a cage." "Only if we stay in the corners," Elias said. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, archaic data wafer. "I've got the bypass codes for the secondary docking bay, but I don't have the muscle to get through the automated sentries. I have the know-how, but I lack the teeth." Varazul looked at the wafer, then at the human who seemed to have made a peace with the void long ago. She didn't take the wafer. Instead, she stood up, her shadow engulfing the table once more. "The tea was acceptable," she said, her voice regaining its metallic edge. "Do not be late, Elias Thorne. If the void cell comes, I would prefer you to be at my side rather than a smudge on the floor." She turned and vanished into the corridor, her phase shift armor rendering her invisible before she even cleared the door. Elias sat alone in the silence. He picked up his cup and finished the dregs. The tea was cold now. Outside the viewport, the whispering void churned in shades of bruised purple and dying gold. He had 24 hours before the Ocularis Accord was set to be signed, and 300,000 lives were signed away with it. 24 hours, he muttered to the empty room. Plenty of time for another cup. Varazul moved through the ventilation shafts of Sector 7G with the silent intensity of a ghost. To the rest of the station, she was a nightmare in obsidian, a creature that demanded space and silence. But inside her own mind, she was a storm of conflicting data. The human, her Xandari instincts were screaming. They were calibrated to detect the rhythm of a heart, the heat of blood, the electric crackle of a nervous system. Elias Thorne's biology was loud. His heart was aged, his lungs were slightly scarred by some atmospheric toxin, and his scent was a mess of jasmine and old sorrow. By all tactical accounts, he was a non-threat, a piece of organic debris in a galaxy of predators. And yet, her synaptic resonator was flagging him as a Class A anomaly. She paused at a junction, her claws digging into the alloy plating of the shaft. She replayed the encounter in the sanctuary hall. She had entered with her kill aura at maximum intensity, a biological frequency designed to paralyze most sentient beings. Even the Kael'thaks, a species of silicon-based warriors, usually suffered a momentary lag in their processing when she was in the room. Elias Thorne hadn't blinked. He had looked at her as if she were a weary traveler rather than a herald of death. There was a profound, terrifying stillness in him. It wasn't the stillness of the brave, nor the ignorance of the foolish. It was the stillness of a man who had already seen the end of the world and found it tedious. "Incomplete data," she hissed to herself, the sound lost in the rushing air of the vents. "Species, human. Subtype, diplomat. Tactical value, 0. Psychological impact. High. She reached her private quarters, a sparse, lightless chamber near the station's cooling fins. She didn't need furniture. She needed focus. She dropped from the vent and landed silently on the cold floor, her armor disengaging with a soft, liquid hiss. Her true skin was a deep, iridescent teal, covered in fine sensory cilia that picked up the vibrations of the station. The void cell. The human had mentioned it by name. It was a word she had found buried in the Xandari military's deep black archives. A theoretical conspiracy, a ghost story told by older hunters to explain why entire outposts sometimes vanished without a trace. They weren't just a political faction. They were a cult of efficiency, believing that the galaxy's resources were being wasted on unproductive species. And humanity was at the top of their waste list. Verazul walked to her viewport. The Ocularis Nexus was a masterpiece of engineering, 3 concentric rings of habitat and commerce spinning around a central spire. It was a monument to the lie of peace. She could see the Valthari ships docking, their iridescent hulls gleaming. They were ground pounders at heart, obsessed with trade and territory. They didn't see the shadows lengthening in the corridors. Her communicator chirped. A high frequency burst from her high command. Verazul, report. The voice was Commander Vax, her handler. The human delegation remains compliant, Commander, she said, her voice flat. I have established a baseline of intimidation. The accords will proceed as scheduled. Good. Ensure the human Thorn is present at the signing. He is a pivotal variable according to the overseers. Do not lose him. Verazul froze. A pivotal variable? He is a liaison, Commander. Why does a single human matter to the High Command? You are a hunter, Zul. You do not ask why the wind blows. You just follow the scent. Keep him zeroed in. If he moves, you move. If he tries to bug out, terminate him. Copy that? Copy that, she whispered. The connection cut. Verazul felt a coldness in her cilia that had nothing to do with the station's cooling system. Her own people were in on it. The Xandari sovereignty, the proud hunters of the stars, were acting as the sheepdogs for a harvest. They weren't just making a treaty, they were preparing a dinner plate. She thought of the tea, the jasmine, the way Elias Thorne's hands hadn't shaken when she reached for the cup. He had known. He had probably known for months that his own superiors and hers were shaking hands in the dark. That was the source of his stillness. He wasn't brave. He was simply waiting for the inevitable. You're not a diplomat, Elias, she whispered to the dark. You're a dead man walking. She reached for her phase blade. The hilt hummed against her palm, hungry for a charge. Her instincts told her to follow orders, to be the hunter, to kill the human and preserve the purity of the Xandari mission. But there was another feeling, something foreign and jagged, cutting through her engineered psyche. It was the memory of the human pushing the second cup toward her. Connection precedes agreement. She had never been offered anything she hadn't first taken by force. The tea was a gift, a small, insignificant, illogical gift given in the face of certain death. Illogical, she muttered, incredibly inefficient. She began to pack her gear. She didn't pack the heavy ordnance or the long-range rifles. She packed the close-quarters disruptors and the stealth shroud. If she was going to do this, if she was going to bet her life on the stillness of a human, she needed to be fast. She checked the station time. 2,200 hours. She had 2 hours before the pre-summit lockdown. 2 hours to find Elias Thorne and decide if she was going to be the hunter who caught him or the one who stood by him when the void finally opened its mouth. She slipped back into the vents, her armor turning the color of the dark. Let's see if your earth herbs really can calm the nerves, human, she thought. Because tonight, we're going to need more than jasmine to survive what's coming. As she moved through the bowels of the station, she passed the primary meditation chamber. Through the grates, she saw a group of Silthians chanting, their rhythmic swaying a desperate attempt to find peace. She felt a pang of something like pity, a human emotion she had no business feeling. They were praying to gods who weren't listening, while a human sat in a room and waited for a hunter to share his tea. She knew which one was more powerful. She reached Elias's quarters in Sector 3. She didn't use the door. She dropped from the ceiling, landing in the center of his small, cluttered room. He was sitting on the floor, surrounded by old physical books and a flickering holomap of the station. He didn't jump. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just looked up, a small, tired smile on his face. "You're late, Barazul," he said, tapping his wrist where a watch would be. "I was beginning to think you didn't like the chamomile." "The chamomile is irrelevant," she growled, though her armor didn't cycle into an aggressive stance. "My command has ordered your termination if you leave this room. We are hard locked into the harvest sequence, Elias. Your people, my people, they've already shaken hands on the price of our souls." Elias stood up, his joints popping. He looked small compared to her, but his presence filled the cramped room. "I know. My director just sent me a thank you for your service message. It's the diplomatic equivalent of a blindfold and a cigarette." "Then why are you smiling?" "Because," Elias said, picking up a heavy, ancient-looking rucksack, "I finally found someone who hates the plan as much as I do. Now, are we going to stand here and discuss my mortality, or are we going to bug out and ruin Director Kalen's very expensive party?" Verazul looked at him, this fragile, illogical, stubborn ape. "We bug out," she said, the human slang feeling strange in her mouth. "Good choice," Elias said. "I've got the bypass, you've got the claws. Let's go make some history." Together they vanished into the shadows of the Ocularis Nexus, the first alliance of its kind in 10,000 years of star travel. A hunter and her prey, walking side by side into the mouth of the wolf. The service conduits of Sector 9 were never designed for a human to navigate, let alone a 6-foot-tall Xandari huntress in full phase shift plating. The air here was thick with the scent of ozone and the oily musk of industrial lubricants, a far cry from the sanitized, jasmine-scented peace of the upper tiers. For Elias Thorne, every step was a reminder of his own physical limitations. His knees ached with a dull, rhythmic throb, and his breath came in ragged, shallow pulls that seemed to echo too loudly against the ribbed alloy of the walls. Beside him, Varazul was a phantom. Her armor had bled into the dull gray of the bulkhead, rendering her nearly invisible to the naked eye. Only the occasional shimmer of her violet eyes and the soft, metallic click of her talons against the floor gave her away. She moved with a liquid economy of motion that made Elias feel like a stumbling toddler. "Stay sharp, Elias," he told himself, adjusting the strap of his rucksack. "This isn't a tea room anymore." They had been moving for nearly 4 hours, threading through the station's ghost lanes, decommissioned maintenance shafts, and forgotten storage pockets that bypassed the primary security sweeps. Elias led the way, his eyes glued to a cracked handheld datapad that displayed a flickering, low-resolution schematic of the Ocularis Nexus. "The secondary uplink is 3 levels down," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the nearby coolant pipes. "If we can tap into the core from there, we can see exactly what kind of harvest the void cell is cooking up. We're currently zeroed in on the auxiliary junction, but the signal is weak." Verazul paused, her head tilting, as her synaptic resonator scanned the corridor ahead. "Movement," she signaled through the short-range comms embedded in Elias's ear. 2 sectors forward, heavy signatures, not station security, too quiet, too synchronized. "Shadow stalkers," Elias muttered, using the street slang for the void cell's specialized wetwork teams. "The brass must have realized we've gone dark. They're ghosting the perimeter." "They are scent blind," Barazul replied, her voice a low vibration in his chest. "But they have thermal eyes. Your biology is a flare in this cold dark, Elias. You are radiating heat like a dying star." "I'll try to keep my existential dread to a minimum," Elias retorted, a flash of his old dry humor cutting through the tension. "But unless you've got a portable freezer I can jump into, we're going to have to outrun them." "How far to the next atmospheric seal?" 50 meters, but the door is hard-locked." Elias wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. "Nothing is hard-locked if you know the back doors. Keep me covered, Zul. I need 5 minutes at the terminal." They moved with a sudden, desperate urgency. The shadow stalkers were closing in, their presence marked only by the minute fluctuations in the station's localized gravity, a side effect of their high-end stealth drives. To Elias, it felt like the air itself was beginning to curdle. When they reached the atmospheric seal, Elias dropped to his knees, his fingers flying across the terminal's tactile interface. He wasn't just a diplomat, he was a survivor of the frontier, a man who had learned early on that a well-placed line of code was often more effective than a dozen peace treaties. "Talk to me, you old heap of scrap," he hissed at the terminal. Behind him, Varazul had shifted into a combat crouch, her phase blade extending with a hiss of ionized air. She was a wall of obsidian and violet light, standing between Elias and the approaching dark. "3 minutes," she warned. "They have reached the junction." "I'm in," Elias grunted, his eyes scanning the data streams that began to flood his screen. "Wait, what the hell is this?" The data wasn't just a harvest log, it was a transaction record. He saw the names of the High Overseers, the seals of the Xandari sovereignty, and, most devastatingly, the digital signature of Director Kalen, the head of the human delegation. "Kalen," Elias whispered, the word tasting like copper in his mouth. "He didn't just sign the accords. He sold the mining rights to the outer colonies, all of them, millions of people. He's trading them for protected status for the inner systems. It's a buyout. We aren't the guests at this summit, Zul. We're the currency." The realization hit him harder than a physical blow. For years he had worked under Kalen, believing that even in their failures, they were at least trying to protect the remnants of humanity. But this wasn't failure. This was a calculated betrayal, a choice to sacrifice the many to save the worthy few. "He sold us out," Elias said, his voice trembling. "He's giving the Void Cell the coordinates for Kalis 5 and the Velonis territories. They'll be harvested for biological material and raw minerals before the next solar cycle. Kalen's just looking for a seat at the big table, even if that table is built on the bones of his own people." "The Xandari are no better," Varazul said, her gaze never wavering from the dark corridor. "The sovereignty sees this as an efficiency correction. They believe that by aiding the Void Cell, they ensure their own survival when the Great Hunger finally reaches this sector. We are all becoming monsters to avoid the dark." "Not all of us," Elias said, snapping the data wafer out of the terminal. "This goes public, now. If we can reach the broadcast spire in Sector 1, we can beam this to every delegation on the station. It won't stop the harvest, but it'll blow the lid off the conspiracy. Nobody stays quiet when they realize their own neck is on the block." "The door's open," Varazul signaled. "Move! Now!" They slipped through the seal just as a burst of hypervelocity needles chewed into the alloy where Elias had been kneeling. The shadow stalkers had found them. The chase that followed was a blur of cramped tunnels and vertical drops. Elias felt his age in every joint, his muscles screaming as he hauled himself through the labyrinthine guts of the ocularis. He fell twice, the cold floor bruising his ribs. But each time Varazul's powerful grip was there, hauling him back to his feet before he could even register the pain. "Don't stop," she commanded, her voice a rhythmic pulse. "Your heart is laboring, Elias. Focus on the beat. Follow my lead." "I'm trying," he panted, his vision beginning to swim. "Just a bit of mechanical failure on my end." "You are not a machine. You are a human. Use your stubbornness. It is the only thing about your species that is tactically superior." They reached a pressurized maintenance bay filled with rows of dormant repair drones. It was a cavernous space, smelling of dry dust and static. Elias leaned against a shipping crate, his chest heaving. He looked at the rucksack, then at the data wafer in his hand. "Why are you doing this, Zul?" he asked, his voice cracking. "You're a hero of the sovereignty. You could have turned me in and been promoted to high guard. Why throw it all away for a soft skin who can barely run a kilometer without a heart attack?" Varazul deactivated her phase blade, the violet light fading into the dim emergency lighting of the bay. She stepped closer, her height making her seem like a pillar of the station itself. "I told you," she said, her voice softer than Elias had ever heard it. "I am a loy, a glitch. My sisters see the hunt as an equation. I see the prey. I see the eyes. When I looked at you in that room, I didn't see an equation. I saw a mirror." "A mirror? You carry the same emptiness I do, Elias Thorne. The stillness of someone who has lost their home and found no replacement. We are both ghosts wandering a station that wants to forget we exist. If I let you die, I am simply confirming that the Void Cell is right, that we are all just resources to be used and discarded." She reached out, her clawed hand hovering near his shoulder, hesitant. "Connection is the only thing that doesn't rust in the void," she whispered. My people have forgotten that. I think your people have too. We have to remind them. Elias looked at her, and for the first time since the destruction of Kalis IV, the cold weight in his chest felt a little lighter. He reached up and placed his hand over hers, the warm, weathered skin of a man against the cold, iridescent teal of a huntress. Yeah, Elias said, his voice regaining its strength. Let's give them a reminder they won't forget. The sound of the bay doors being forced open echoed through the chamber. The shadow stalkers had arrived, and this time, they weren't just bringing needles. The heavy thrum of a plasma disruptor began to whine, charging up for a killing blow. Time to go, Elias said, his eyes hardening. Time to hunt, Verazul corrected. They dove into the shadows of the repair drones just as the first bolt of plasma turned the shipping crate into molten slag. The game had changed. It wasn't about the tea anymore. It was about making sure the truth survived, even if they didn't. Verazul's world was a symphony of data, thermal gradients, and the frantic rhythmic drumming of Elias Thorne's heart. As they sprinted through the lower hydroponics bay of Sector 12, she felt every micro-twitch in his muscles, every spike of adrenaline in his blood. He was failing physically. His respiratory rate was far beyond the safety parameters for a human of his age. But his stillness remained. It was the eye of a storm, a core of cold, hard intent that even her Xandari senses couldn't fully penetrate. Left, Elias shouted, his voice a rasping bark. Through the nutrient vats! The sensors can't track through the liquid fertilizer. Verazul didn't question him. She pivoted mid-air, her talons digging into the ceiling as she swung herself and the human over a massive tank of bubbling green sludge. They landed on the far side, hidden behind a forest of genetically modified soy stalks that grew in dense, towering thickets. Behind them, the shadow stalkers were a low-frequency hum. They were methodical, moving in a diamond formation designed to flush out prey in confined spaces. They are within 20 meters, Verazul signaled, her armor shimmering as it struggled to match the verdant green of the hydroponics bay. Their disruptors are cycling. They intend to level the entire sector to ensure our elimination. Standard void cell SOP, Elias muttered, crouching low in the dirt. He was covered in grime, his once crisp diplomatic suit torn and stained with grease. They don't do clean anymore. They just do gone. How many? 4. 2 Vanguard, 2 Mark snipers. They are using seismic pings to locate us. Elias looked at the towering soy stalks, then at the massive irrigation pipes overhead. A grim tactical light entered his eyes, the look of a man who had spent too much time on the wrong end of a war. Zul, can you rupture that main pressure line? The one with the orange markings? Verazul scanned the pipe. It is a high-pressure methane infusion line. If I breach it, the gas will be lethal to your biology within 90 seconds. And any spark will turn this entire bay into a miniature sun. Exactly, Elias said, pulling a small, battered flare gun from his rucksack, a relic from his time on the Kalis frontier. I've got an atmospheric mask in the bag. It won't last long, but it'll give me enough time to move. You can phase shift through the heat, right? I can, but the risk to you is 98%. I like those odds, Elias said, his smile tight and jagged. They're better than the 0% we have if we stay here. On my signal, you hit the pipe. I'll provide the spark. While they're dealing with the fireball, we slip through the drainage grates at the bottom of the vats. They lead directly to the Sector 1 service lift. Verazul looked at him. She saw the sweat on his face, the tremor in his hands, and the absolute, terrifying certainty in his eyes. He was willing to burn himself to ash just to open a door. You are a very strange being, Elias Thorne, she whispered. I've been told, he replied, pulling the mask over his face. The hiss of bottled oxygen was the only sound in the sudden silence of the bay. Now, do it! Verazul didn't hesitate. She launched a phase bolt with surgical precision, the concentrated energy shearing through the alloy pipe like a hot wire through wax. A roar of pressurized gas filled the chamber, a white cloud of methane erupting into the space. The shadow stalkers surged forward, their silhouettes ghost-like in the mist. Elias didn't wait. He leveled the flare gun and pulled the trigger. The world turned white. The explosion was a physical weight, a wall of heat and sound that tossed Elias backward like a rag doll. Even through her armor's thermal dampeners, Varazul felt the searing intensity of the blast. The hydroponics bay was transformed into a furnace, the soy stalks vaporizing instantly, the nutrient vats shattering and spraying boiling sludge in every direction. She moved through the fire like a vengeful spirit, her armor glowing a dull, angry red. She found Elias 10 meters away, slumped against a cooling unit. His mask was cracked and his clothes were smoldering, but he was alive, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Up!" she commanded, her voice a roar through the comms. She threw him over her shoulder and dove into the drainage grate, the metal glowing with heat. They slid down a dark, slime-coated chute, falling for what felt like miles before splashing into the cold, stagnant water of the waste reclamation levels. Elias coughed, a wet, racking sound that made Varazul's cilia twitch with concern. He pulled off the mask and gulped in the damp, foul-smelling air of the sewers. Did it work?" he gasped, his face pale and streaked with soot. "The stalkers are neutralized," Varazul said, scanning the area. "Their stealth units would have been fried by the electromagnetic pulse of the explosion. We have a lead, but you are injured." I'm fine," Elias lied, clutching his side. "Just a few third-degree reminders of why I hate pyrotechnics. How far to the lift?" 500 meters. But the station's internal security is going into full lockdown. They know we're in the waistlines." They began to wade through the knee-deep water, the only sound the distant dripping of pipes and the heavy splash of their footsteps. The stillness in Elias was beginning to fray, replaced by a raw, naked exhaustion. He was leaning more and more of his weight on Varazul, his steps becoming erratic. "Elias," she said, stopping him in a small dry alcove beneath a massive support pylon. "We must rest, even for 10 minutes. Your cardiovascular system is nearing a catastrophic failure event." "No time," he muttered, his head sagging. "The summit, the signing, it's at midnight. If we don't get the data to the spire, it's all over." "If you die, the data dies with you," she countered, forcing him to sit. She knelt before him, her violet eyes scanning his vitals. "Talk to me. Use your words to keep your brainstem engaged. Why do you do this? Why Kalis? Why the empty soul?" Elias leaned his head back against the cold stone, his eyes closing for a moment. "Kalis 4 wasn't just a colony, Zul. It was an experiment. We wanted to see if we could build a world that didn't rely on the old power structures. No corporations, no military juntas, just people, living. We thought we were safe because we were insignificant." He took a shaky breath. "But insignificance is a target for people like the Void Cell. They didn't want the land. They wanted the data from our biosphere research. They arrived at 6 in the evening on a Tuesday. By midnight, there was nothing left but ash. I was in the deep-bore mines when the orbital bombardment hit. I spent 3 days digging my way out, only to find a world that was silent." He opened his eyes, and the hollow grief in them was more chilling than the shadows of the sewer. "I realized then that safety is a lie we tell ourselves so we can sleep. The only thing that's real is the connection we have in the moment, the trust we build when the world is burning. I failed Kalis because I wasn't looking at the shadows. I was looking at the stars. I won't fail again. I won't let Kalen turn the rest of the colonies into another silence." Varazul remained silent for a long moment, the water rushing past them in a steady, mournful rhythm. She felt the weight of his words, the human burden of memory and loss. Her own species didn't memorialize suffering. They optimized it. If a hunt failed, you analyzed the error and moved on. You didn't carry the ash with you. But as she looked at Elias, she realized that the ash was what made him strong. It was the fuel for his stubbornness, the reason he could stand in the path of a sun killer and offer tea. "You carry a planet's worth of grief," she said softly. "It is a wonder you can even walk." "It gets lighter when you have someone to help you carry it," Elias said, looking at her. "Even if that someone has claws and a kill aura that can stop a heart." Varazul felt a strange, warm sensation in her primary neural node, a chemical response her training couldn't identify. She reached out and touched his face, her thumb tracing the line of soot across his cheek. "I will carry the data, Elias, and I will carry you. We will reach the spire. We will ruin their party." Spoken like a true diplomat, Elias joked, his voice regaining a bit of its rasping strength. All right, Zul, let's get out of this sewer. I'm starting to smell like a Valthari's lunch. They stood up together, a battered human and an iridescent huntress, two ghosts of a failing station. They moved toward the Sector 1 lift, not as hunter and prey, but as something new, a connection forged in fire and grief, stronger than any treaty, more enduring than any empire. Above them, the station roared as the void cell began its final preparations for the harvest. But in the dark, beneath the layers of metal and ice, the silence had been broken. And once the silence is gone, the truth has a way of finding the light. The service lift climbed with an agonizing rhythmic groan that seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of Elias Thorne's bones. They were ascending from the bowels of Sector 12, moving upward toward the gleaming, treacherous heights of the spire. The air in the lift was stale, smelling of ionized copper and the metallic tang of Varazul's cooling armor. Elias sat huddled in the corner, his back against the vibrating alloy wall, clutching his side where the heat from the explosion had left a jagged, blistering souvenir. He was 36 years old, but in the dim, flickering light of the lift, he felt as ancient as the starlight that bathed the station's exterior. Every breath was a negotiation with his own lungs, a shallow, whistling effort that tasted of smoke and failure. He looked up at Varazul. She stood like a statue of obsidian, her violet eyes fixed on the floor indicator as it crept past the 45th level. "You look like you're about to drop, Elias," a voice whispered in the back of his mind. It sounded like Kalen, smooth and condescending. "You were never built for the crawl. You were built for the parlor." Elias shoved the thought away, gritting his teeth. He reached into his rucksack and pulled out the small, dented flask of water he'd been saving. He took a sip, the lukewarm liquid barely wetting his parched throat. "We have 10 floors until the primary security bypass," Varazul said, her voice a low rumble that bypassed the air and settled in his chest. Her armor was still cycling through a series of dull, matte patterns, trying to find a configuration that wouldn't flag them on the internal sensors. "The lift is being tracked. They are letting us ascend." Elias frowned, wiping a smudge of grease from his brow. "They're funneling us. Kalen knows I'm headed for the spire. He wants the data wafer back before I can broadcast the dirty laundry. If they vaped us in the sewers, the wafer might have been lost. Up here, it's a controlled environment." "Then we are walking into a kill box," Varazul noted, her phase blade humming softly at her hip. "A tactical error. My sisters would call this a suicide run." "It's not an error if you know the house is cheating," Elias replied, his voice a rasping shadow of its former self. "Kalen thinks I'm still playing by the rules of the Accords. He thinks I'm trying to save my skin. He doesn't realize I've already written that off." Varazul turned to look at him, her burning violet gaze scanning his face with a precision that made him feel uncomfortably transparent. "Why, Elias? Why is the truth worth the termination of your biological sequence? Most species value the continuation of the self above all else. You are an anomaly." Elias looked at his hands, stained with the soot of a world that didn't exist anymore. "Because a lie is a slow poison, Zul. It doesn't just kill the body, it hollows out the soul until there's nothing left but a shell that follows orders. I spent 3 days digging through the ash of Kalis 4. I saw what happens when the powerful decide that some lives are just background noise. If I stay quiet now, I'm just another piece of that noise." He looked up at her, his eyes hard and clear despite the pain. "Trust isn't about knowing you're going to win. It's about knowing that even if you lose, you didn't lose who you were in the process. I'm betting my life that there's still someone out there who gives a damn about the truth. And I'm betting it on you, too." Varazul's armor pulsed once, a bright, brief flash of iridescent teal that illuminated the cramped lift. She stepped closer, her massive frame looming over him, but there was no predatory aura this time, only a strange, heavy silence. "Trust is a heavy burden for a hunter," she whispered. "We are bred to rely only on the pack's hierarchy. To trust an outsider is to introduce a variable that cannot be controlled. It is inefficient." "And yet, here you are," Elias said softly, "bugging out with the most inefficient creature in the galaxy." The lift slowed, the floor indicator flashing red as it reached the 55th level. A chime echoed through the small space, sounding like a funeral bell. The doors slid open to reveal a long, sterile corridor bathed in the harsh, white light of the spire's primary security hub. At the far end stood a biometric gate, a shimmering curtain of blue energy that required a synchronized neural handshake to pass. "This is the ritual," Varazul signaled. "The gate is a synaptic mirror. It measures the alignment of those passing through. If our intent is fractured, or if one of us is coerced, the energy curtain will trigger a localized neuropurge." Elias stood up, his legs shaking, and leaned heavily against the wall. "A neuropurge. Sounds like a real riot. How do we pass?" "We must be of one mind," she said, reaching out her long, clawed hand. "You must let me into your resonance, Elias. No secrets, no shields. You must trust me with the ash of your world, and I must trust you with the glitch in my blood." Elias hesitated. He had spent 15 years building walls around the memory of Kalis IV. He had turned his grief into armor, a cold, hard shell that kept the world at a distance. To let someone in, especially a Xandari, was to stand naked in the void. "If we fumble this, we're both vaped," he muttered, looking at her hand. "I will not let you fall, Elias Thorne," she said, her voice carrying a harmonic depth that made his heart skip a beat. "I am no longer hunting you. I am standing with you." Elias took a deep breath, and then he reached out. He placed his hand in hers, the warmth of his skin meeting the cold, alien texture of her palm. He closed his eyes and let the walls go. The world vanished. Suddenly, he wasn't in a service lift. He was standing on the surface of Kalis IV, the sky a bruised purple, the air smelling of blooming heather and ozone. He saw the faces of the people he'd lost, his sister, his friends, the quiet miners who had shared their bread with him. He felt the crushing weight of the bombardment, the heat of the fire, the absolute soul-destroying silence that followed. And then he felt Varazul. She was a presence of cold, sharp light, moving through his memories like a navigator through a starfield. She saw the ash, the grief, and the stubborn, flickering hope that he had tried so hard to hide. She didn't judge. She didn't analyze. She simply witnessed. In return, he felt her. He felt the sterile, cold training of the Xandari hives. He felt the thrill of the hunt, the pride of the kill, and then the slow, creeping horror of realizing that she was a tool in a game she didn't understand. He felt her loneliness, the crushing weight of being a creature built for murder, who wanted only to understand why the stars were beautiful. They were two broken things, standing in the dark, holding on to each other because the alternative was to disappear. The blue energy of the synaptic mirror washed over them, a cool, tingling sensation that felt like a spring rain. The curtain rippled, analyzed the two souls entwined in the dark, and then, with a soft, melodic chime, it dissolved. The path to the core was open. Elias opened his eyes, gasping for air as the sterile white light of the corridor rushed back in. He was still holding Varazul's hand, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The connection lingered, a phantom resonance that made the air between them feel charged and alive. "That was," Elias started, his voice failing him. "Unprecedented," Varazul finished. Her violet eyes were no longer apertures of data. They were deep, luminous pools that reflected a soul she had only just discovered. "Your ash is very heavy, Elias, but it is also very bright." Elias leaned against her, his strength finally giving out. "Let's get to the spire, Zul, before the brass sends someone else to clean up the mess." They moved down the corridor together, no longer just a diplomat and a huntress, but a single entity forged in the fire of shared truth. They were moving toward the heart of the conspiracy, and for the first time in his life, Elias Thorne wasn't afraid of the silence. He had someone to talk to. The primary core of the Ocularis Nexus was not a machine room. It was a cathedral of light and glass, a soaring, multi-tiered chamber that looked out onto the rotating rings of the station and the vast, swirling purple of the whispering void. At the center of the chamber stood the broadcast spire, a towering needle of translucent carbon fiber that pulsed with the blue-white light of the station's neural network. This was the throat of the Nexus, the place where every word spoken in 46 languages was translated, recorded, and sent out to the stars. It was also a graveyard. Elias and Verazul stepped onto the observation platform, and Elias felt the breath leave his body. Below them, arranged in neat, concentric circles around the base of the spire, were hundreds of stasis pods. Each pod was occupied by a human. They weren't soldiers or politicians. They were civilians, the displaced from the outer colonies that the Nexus had supposedly been helping to resettle. They aren't being moved to new worlds, Elias whispered, his voice trembling with a raw, jagged fury. They're being used as anchors. Verazul walked to the edge of the platform, her sensors scanning the pods below. Their neural patterns are being harvested in real time, she said, her voice a low, dangerous growl. The void cell isn't just killing them. They are using the human capacity for rapid adaptation to stabilize the station's ancient processing core. You are the grease in their gears, Elias. Your suffering provides the emotional resonance needed to keep the synaptic resonators from crashing under the weight of so many alien minds. It's efficient, a voice said from the shadows of the upper gallery. Horribly, beautifully efficient. Elias turned, his hand going instinctively to the data wafer in his pocket. Emerging from the gloom was Director Kalen. He looked immaculate in his silver diplomatic robes, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his expression one of weary, paternal disappointment. He wasn't alone. Two Xandari high guards stood behind him, their heavy phase cannons leveled at Verazul. Kalen, Elias spat, you sold them, your own people. For what? A seat on the council? A little bit of protected status while the rest of the galaxy burns? You always were a romantic, Elias, Kalen said, walking to the railing and looking down at the rows of pods. I didn't sell them. I saved them. Humanity is a young species, a fragile thing in a universe that eats the weak for breakfast. We don't have the teeth of the Xandari or the ancient wisdom of the Valthari, but we have this weird, chaotic adaptability. By plugging them into the Nexus, I've made us indispensable. As long as these people are the core of the galaxy's communication, humanity cannot be destroyed. We are the system now. You're a battery, Kalen, Elias shouted, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. You've turned your own species into a biological component. That's not survival. That's a lobotomy. It's the price of a future, Kalen countered, his eyes hardening. The Void Cell is the only organization that understands the coming dark. The ancient entities are waking up, Elias. The whispering void is hungry. If we don't build a stable, unified galactic structure now, no matter the cost, we will all be vaped before the next century is out. These people in the pods, they are the martyrs for a species that would otherwise be extinct. Then let them be martyrs by choice, not by kidnapping, Elias said, stepping forward. He pulled the data wafer from his rucksack and held it high. I have the logs, Kalen. I have the signatures. I have the proof that you and the sovereignty engineered the collapse of the Kalis colonies just to get your hands on the refugees. I'm going to broadcast this to every ship in the sector. Kalen sighed, a sound of genuine regret. You won't, Elias, because if you trigger that broadcast, the security protocols will immediately disconnect the pods. The neural feedback will kill every one of those 300 souls instantly. Their minds will be fried before the first sentence of your truth hits the airwaves. Elias froze. He looked at the pods below, then at the wafer in his hand. The weight of 300 lives suddenly felt like a mountain on his chest. Is he lying, Zul? Elias whispered. Elias. Varzul scanned the console nearest to her. Her violet eyes flickered with a frantic stream of data. The feedback loop is real, she signaled. It is a dead-hand protocol. The system is designed to erase the evidence and the anchors if a breach is detected. He has turned their lives into a shield for his lie. Kalen smiled. Give me the wafer, Elias. Come back to the fold. I can make sure Verazul is given amnesty. We can say she was undercover, helping you uncover a rogue element. You can have your tea, your books, your peace. You just have to let this one truth go, for their sake. Ilias looked at the pods. He saw a young girl in one of the nearest units, her eyes closed, her face peaceful in a dream she would never wake from. He felt the ash of Kailas 4 rising in his throat, a bitter, choking reminder of what happens when you stay quiet. This is the choice, Zul, Elias whispered, his voice barely a breath. If I speak, they die. If I stay silent, the lie grows until it eats the whole galaxy. What kind of connection is that? Vera Zul stepped beside him, her armor brushing against his shoulder. She didn't look at Kalen. She looked at the humans in the pods. They are already dead, Elias, she said, her voice a low morning vibration. Their bodies breathe, but their souls are being harvested by a machine that doesn't know their names. To leave them, there is to let them be forgotten while they are still alive. That is the greatest cruelty of all. She turned to him, her violet eyes burning with an intensity that made the room feel small. Trust yourself, Elias Thorne. You told me that trust is about knowing who you are, even if you lose. Who are you? Are you the man who hides in the ash, or the man who brings the light? Elias looked at Kalen. The director looked confident, his hand outstretched, waiting for the surrender. He was a man who believed in the math of the universe, in the cold, hard logic of survival at any cost. But Elias Thorne was a human, and humans were illogical. I'm the man who makes the tea, Elias said, his voice cold and steady, and I'm done letting you choose who gets to drink it. Elias didn't hand over the wafer. Instead, he slammed it into the auxiliary port of the broadcast spire, his fingers flying across the override codes he'd spent the last 4 hours memorizing. Broadcast sequence initiated, the station's voice announced, calm and indifferent. Kalen's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Kill them, he screamed to the high guards. Kill them both! Vera Zul moved before the words had even left his mouth. She was a blur of obsidian and violet light, her phase blade erupting into a roaring arc of energy that sheared through the floor of the observation platform. She didn't attack the guards. She attacked the supports. The platform groaned and tilted, sending Kalen and his guards stumbling toward the edge. Vera Zul grabbed Elias and dove toward the central pillar of the spire, her claws digging into the carbon fiber as they slid toward the base. Above them, the spire began to pulse with a blinding, incandescent light. The data was flowing. The truth was screaming out into the void, bypassing the filters, bypassing the sensors, hitting every ship, every station, every neural link in the Andromeda sector. Elias watched as the status lights on the pods below began to flicker from green to a diagnostic amber. The feedback loop was engaging. He could feel the scream of 300 minds in the back of his own brain, a phantom agony that made his vision swim. I'm sorry, he whispered, tears streaming down his soot-stained face. I'm so sorry. But as the broadcast reached its peak, something happened that Kalen hadn't predicted. The human anchors, those 300 souls plugged into the core, didn't just die. They responded. Their neural patterns, forged in the chaos of a young, adaptable species, didn't shatter under the feedback. They synchronized with the broadcast. They became the amplifiers. The truth didn't just go out as data. It went out as a wave of collective grief and resolve, a human resonance that shattered the cold logic of the synaptic mirror. The station shuddered. The lights in the core flared into a brilliant golden white, and then, with a sound like 1,000 glass bells breaking at once, the stasis pods hissed open. The feedback hadn't killed them. It had woken them up. Vera Zul landed at the base of the spire, shielding Elias with her own body as the chamber was flooded with the release of pressurized gas and the frantic cries of the newly awakened. Elias looked around, his heart pounding in his chest. They were alive. Weak, confused, and traumatized, but alive. The dead hand had failed because Kalen had underestimated the very thing he was trying to harvest, the stubborn, illogical refusal of a human mind to be just a component in someone else's machine. Up in the gallery, Kalen stood alone, his guards disarmed and retreating as the station's security forces, now seeing the truth on their own screens, began to turn their weapons on the leadership. He looked down at Elias, his face pale, his immaculate robes torn. You've destroyed it all, Elias, he whispered, his voice lost in the chaos. You've left us defenseless against the dark. No, Kalen, Elias said, standing up on shaky legs, supported by the obsidian hand of a huntress. I've just given us a reason to fight it. Vera Zul looked at the humans around them, then at Elias. Her armor was still glowing with the golden light of the core. "The hunt is over, Elias Thorne." "No," Elias replied, looking at the stars through the viewport. "I think the real hunt is just beginning." The Ocularis Nexus was no longer a monument to diplomacy. It had become a sprawling, three-dimensional charnel house. The golden light of the core had faded, replaced by the flickering, stuttering red of emergency strobes that painted the corridors in the color of old blood. The air was a thick soup of ozone, burning insulation, and the sharp copper tang of multiple species biological fluids. Elias Thorne leaned against a jagged shard of carbon fiber, his breath coming in whistling, ragged gasps. Around him, the cathedral of the core was in shambles. The 300 refugees, weak and disoriented, were huddled together in small, shivering groups. Some were weeping, others were staring at the ceiling with the hollow eyes of those who had seen the inside of a nightmare and realized it was still following them. "Keep it together, Elias," he thought, his vision blurring. "You didn't wake them up just to watch them get black-bagged by the next wave." Vara Zul was a whirlwind of obsidian shadows 20 meters ahead. She was holding the primary entrance to the core against a squad of Valthari mercenaries, ground pounders who had been hired by Kalen to ensure the harvest went off without a hitch. Her phase blade was a blur of violet light, parrying hypervelocity needles and returning fire with a predatory precision that was terrifying to behold. "Ghost them, Zul!" Elias shouted, his voice cracking. "We've got more movement on the scanners from Sector 11. The huntress didn't reply, but her armor pulsed a deep, resonant indigo. She launched herself forward, her talons finding purchase in the ceiling as she dropped behind the Valthari line. In 3 seconds, the corridor was silent again, save for the hiss of leaking coolant and the low, rhythmic thrum of the station's failing life support. Vara Zul returned to Elias's side, her teal skin damp with exertion. "The Valthari are broken," she signaled, her voice carrying a jagged edge. "But the station is fracturing. The broadcast has triggered a total systemic collapse. The Silthian Collective is accusing the Krell of complicity. The Valthari are demanding blood for their lost trade routes. The 47 species are no longer talking. They are hunting." "It's the shattered accord," Elias muttered, pulling himself up. Kalen was right about one thing. Without the lie, the trust is gone. We've traded a stable prison for a chaotic graveyard. He looked at the refugees. A woman, thin, her hair matted with stasis gel, was holding a small child. They were looking at him with a mixture of terror and hope that felt like a knife in his gut. "We can't stay here," Elias said, his voice regaining a bit of its diplomatic iron. "The void cell is going to vent the atmosphere in this sector to hide the evidence. We have to move the survivors to the secondary docking bay. If we can get them onto the Velonis transport, we can get them off the station." "The Velonis transport is a cargo hauler," Vara Zul noted, her eyes scanning the dark gallery where Kalen had vanished. "It has no shielding against a Xandari blockade. My sisters will vape us before we clear the first ring." "Then we don't clear the ring," Elias said, a desperate plan forming in his mind. "We use the connection, Zul, the resonance we felt in the synaptic mirror. If we can broadcast that, not as data but as a direct neural handshake, we might be able to paralyze the blockade." Vara Zul went still. "You are talking about a collective resonance. It is a theoretical weapon of the old gods. To project that kind of emotional frequency across a sector would require a conduit of immense strength. You would have to plug back in, Elias." "I know," he said softly. "No," she growled, her armor shifting into a sharp, aggressive configuration. "I did not pull you out of the ash just to watch you become a battery for a ghost story. There must be another way, a tactical retreat, a diversion." "Zul, look at them," Elias gestured to the 300. "They aren't soldiers. They aren't diplomats. They're just people who wanted a home. If we don't do this, they're just background noise again. I'm not asking for your permission. I'm asking for your help to reach the secondary core." Vara Zul looked at the refugees, then back at Elias. The stillness in him was gone, replaced by a fierce, burning purpose that made her primary neural node ache. She realized then that this was the cost of connection. It wasn't just about sharing a cup of tea or a moment of truth. It was about the willingness to bear the weight of another's choice, even when that choice was lethal. I hate your species, Elias Thorne, she whispered, her violet eyes luminous with a strange, fierce grief. You make the most few-bar strategic decisions I have ever witnessed. Is that a yes? It is a commitment, she said, her hand closing over his. I will get you to the secondary core. And if you try to leave me behind in the dark, I will hunt you across every star in this void. They began the long, dangerous trek through the fracturing station. It was no longer a journey of stealth. It was a war of attrition. Every junction was a battlefield. Every sector was a different kind of hell. In Sector 7, they were pinned down by a Krell security team that had gone rogue, firing wildly at anything that moved. Varazul didn't kill them. She disarmed them with a surgical brutality that left them alive but broken, a choice that Elias noticed and understood. She was learning that some kills weren't worth the soul. By the time they reached the transition to the docking bays, Elias's rucksack was empty of supplies, and his body was a map of bruises and burns. He was leaning so heavily on Varazul that they were moving as a single, multi-limbed creature of teal and soot. Almost there, Elias panted, his vision narrowing to a small tunnel of light. Just another 500 meters. We have a problem, Varazul signaled, stopping dead. Elias looked ahead. The corridor was blocked by a shimmering wall of distorted space. It wasn't a physical barrier, but a gravitational shear, a sign that the station's power core was beginning to implode. Beyond the shear, standing in the middle of the docking bay, was High Overseer Kalen. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was standing before a massive, ancient terminal that looked like it had been grown rather than built. The terminal was pulsing with a rhythmic, sickly green light that matched the frequency of the whispering void outside. He's calling it, Elias whispered, his blood running cold. The Great Hunger. He's opening the door. Kalen turned, his eyes glowing with the same green light. He looked less like a man and more like a conduit for something vast and indifferent. You think you've won, Elias? Kalen's voice was no longer human. It was a layered chorus of 1,000 voices. You've broken the cage, yes, but the cage was the only thing keeping the hunters out. The void cell isn't a conspiracy of men. It is the survival instinct of the galaxy. We feed the hunger so it does not feed on us. You're just a coward with a silver tongue, Kalen, Elias shouted, stepping into the edge of the gravitational shear. The pressure made his nose bleed, the blood dripping onto his cracked collar. You're afraid of the dark, so you've decided to become the shadow. The hunger is coming, Elias, Kalen said, his hands moving across the ancient console. And it requires a sacrifice. If not the 300, then the station. If not the station, then the sector. I am simply directing the flow. Varazul launched herself forward, but the gravitational shear threw her back with the force of a supernova. She crashed into the bulkhead, her armor sparking as it struggled to maintain integrity. Zul! Elias cried out. Stay! Back! Elias, she groaned, her teal skin flickering with a dull gray pallor. The field. It is tuned to my resonance. It is a Xandari dampener. He knew I would come. Kalen smiled, a cold, empty expression. I knew you both would come. Connection is so predictable, Elias. It creates a tether, and a tether can be used to pull you both into the void. Elias looked at Varazul, pinned against the wall by a force she couldn't fight. He looked at the refugees huddled in the corridor behind them, their lives hanging by a thread. And then he looked at the ancient terminal, pulsing with the hunger of a dying god. He realized then that the lesson wasn't about surviving the dark. It was about what you were willing to bring into it. I'm not a battery, Kalen, Elias said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifying calm. And I'm not a component. He stepped forward into the heart of the gravitational shear. His bones began to creak and the air was squeezed from his lungs, but he didn't stop. He was a man of ash, and ash doesn't break. I'm a diplomat, Elias panted, his fingers reaching for the terminal. And it's time to negotiate a new deal. He slammed his hand onto the console, not to stop the sequence, but to join it. He opened his mind, not to the station's core, but to the resonance he had found with Varazul. He offered the hunger something it had never felt in 10,000 years of cold, calculated consumption. He offered it the weight of his grief, the brightness of his hope, the messy, illogical, beautiful connection of a human soul that refused to be silent. The green light flared into a blinding, incandescent white. The station roared, a sound of agony and revelation. And in the center of the storm, Elias Thorne stood tall, a single human holding back the void with nothing but the truth of who he was. The Great Hunger was not a monster. That was the first thing Elias realized as his consciousness was stripped away from his physical form and pulled into the swirling vortex of the ancient terminal. It was a machine, a vast, neglected, and broken defense network built by a civilization that had vanished eons ago. It was lonely, it was malfunctioning, and it was starving for the one thing its creators had forgotten to give it: a purpose. The void cell had fed it fear. They had fed it the cold, calculated suffering of thousands of anchors to keep it dormant, like a drugged beast in a cage. But Elias was feeding it something else. He was feeding it the jasmine tea. He projected the memory of that first meeting with Varazul, the stillness of the room, the heat of the porcelain, the way the predatory silence had been broken by a simple question. "Would you like some tea?" The hunger recoiled at first, the green light lashing out like a cornered animal. It tried to process the data as a threat, a virus of empathy that threatened its cold, logical structure. But Elias didn't pull back. He leaned into the connection, dragging the ash of Kalis 4 with him. "See this?" he whispered into the collective mind of the machine. "This is what happens when you only value efficiency. This is the silence you're creating. Is this what you were built for? To be a graveyard?" The machine groaned, a massive structural vibration that shook the entire Ocularis nexus. The gravitational shear around the terminal began to waver, the green light flickering and turning a pale, hesitant gold. Outside the mental storm, the physical world was dissolving. Varazul had managed to haul herself off the bulkhead, her armor shattered in a dozen places. She saw Elias standing at the terminal, his body glowing with a terrifying, incandescent light. His skin was translucent, his veins pulsing with the data of 1 billion years. "Elias," she screamed, but her voice was lost in the roar of the imploding sector. Kalen was on the floor, his connection to the hunger severed by the sheer force of Elias's resonance. He was clawing at the deck, his eyes wide and vacant. "You're killing us all," he whimpered. "The void. It will swallow everything." "No," Varazul growled, her hand finding the hilt of her phase blade. "He is teaching it to remember." She looked at the terminal, then at the human who was disappearing into the light. She knew what she had to do. If Elias was the anchor for the truth, she had to be the anchor for him. She couldn't let him do this alone. If he was the ash, she would be the wind that carried it. She stepped into the gravitational field, her phase shift plating screaming as it was pushed to the absolute limit. She didn't fight the pressure this time, she synchronized with it. She let the kill aura of the Xandari drop, replacing it with the jagged, unfamiliar rhythm of the trust she had found in the tea room. She reached out and grabbed Elias's shoulders, her claws digging into his scorched jacket. She closed her eyes and dove into the resonance. Suddenly, Elias wasn't alone in the white light. He felt a sharp, cold presence, a blade of violet light that cut through the hunger's overwhelming data stream. "Zul?" His voice echoed in the void. "What are you doing here? You're going to get vaped." "I told you, Elias Thorne." Her voice vibrated in his mind, fierce and unbreakable. "If you go into the dark, I am coming with you. Your ash is too heavy for one man." Together they stood in the center of the great hunger's mind, a human diplomat and a Xandari huntress, a paradox of biology and intent. They offered the machine a new equation, not 1 + 1, but something that transcended the sum of its parts. They showed it the 47 species, not as resources, but as a chorus. They showed it that the diversity of the Nexus wasn't a flaw to be corrected, but a strength to be harnessed. The machine hesitated. The green light pulsed one last time, a final, desperate gasp of the old logic. And then it broke. The hunger didn't vanish. It transformed. The ancient defense network reorganized itself, its protocols shifting from harvest to integrate. The gravitational shear collapsed, and the sickly green light was replaced by a soft, warm amber that felt like a summer evening on a world that had never known war. The station's life support systems suddenly surged back to life. The flickering strobes stabilized into a steady, comforting glow. The atmospheric seals in the core held. Elias and Varazul were thrown back from the terminal as the connection was severed. They landed on the deck in a heap of bruised limbs and broken armor. The silence that followed was absolute. But it wasn't the predatory silence of the Xandari or the void silence of the machine. It was the quiet of a room after a long, difficult conversation. Elias coughed, a dry, rattling sound, and opened his eyes. He was lying on his back, looking up at the vaulted ceiling of the docking bay. The ancient terminal was dark now, its work finished. Kalen was gone, either fled into the shadows or consumed by the resonance. It didn't matter. He felt a weight on his chest. He looked down to see Varazul's head resting on his shoulder. Her teal skin was pale, and her violet eyes were closed, but she was breathing, her primary neural node pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm. We did it, Elias whispered, his voice a ghost of a sound. Varazul opened her eyes, the violet light dim but clear. Her armor was gone, her true form exposed to the air. She looked at him, and for the first time she smiled. It was a sharp, alien expression, but it was the most beautiful thing Elias had ever seen. You are remarkably inefficient? Elias Thorne, she wheezed. I know, he said, reaching out to touch her hand. But it's a good habit, right? She gripped his hand, her long clawed fingers intertwining with his. Right. The doors to the docking bay hissed open, and the first of the refugees began to filter in, led by the woman and her child. They looked at the two of them, the broken human and the unarmored huntress, and they didn't run. They didn't scream. They walked toward them, their footsteps a soft, rhythmic sound on the alloy floor. The woman knelt beside Elias, her eyes wet with tears. Thank you, she whispered. Elias looked at her, then at the 300 souls behind her. He felt the weight of his grief, but it wasn't a burden anymore. It was a bridge. He had lost Kalis IV, but he had found something else in the dark of the Ocularis Nexus. He had found that connection wasn't a weakness to be exploited. It was the only thing that could survive the void. The great hunger was quiet now, its ancient systems repurposed to protect the very lives it had been meant to consume. The void cell was shattered, their conspiracy exposed to the stars. But as Elias looked out the viewport at the whispering void, he knew the hunt wasn't over. There were still 47 species who didn't know how to talk to each other. There was still a galaxy full of shadows and fear. We have work to do, Zul, Elias said, his voice regaining its strength. The huntress stood up, pulling Elias with her. She looked out at the stars, her iridescent skin catching the light of the 3 habitable worlds in the distance. Then let us begin, she said. I believe you still owe me a cup of tea. They walked toward the Veilonese transport, a human and a huntress, moving into a future that was uncertain, dangerous, and completely unprecedented. They were moving into the light, and for the first time in 10,000 years, the void didn't look so empty. The immediate aftermath of the resonance was not a celebration. It was a heavy, suffocating stillness that felt as though the Ocularis Nexus had held its collective breath for 1,000 years and was only now beginning to exhale. The amber light of the repurposed core bathed the docking bay in a warmth that felt unnatural in the cold vacuum of space. A golden hue that highlighted the soot on Elias Thorne's face and the jagged edges of Varazul's shattered armor. Elias sat on the edge of a transport crate, his hands trembling as he tried to secure a medical patch over the burn on his side. His body felt like a house that had survived a hurricane only to realize the foundation was cracked. Every muscle was a dull ache, and his mind was a kaleidoscope of the billion-year-old data he had briefly carried. But for the first time since the ash of Kalis IV had filled his lungs, the internal silence was gone. You are leaking again, Elias, Varazul said, her voice a low, melodic vibration. She had discarded the ruined plates of her phase shift armor, standing now in her base suit of iridescent mesh. Without the obsidian plates to hide her, she looked less like a monster and more like a work of biological art, her teal skin pulsing with a rhythmic, soft luminescence. It's just a scratch, Zul, Elias grunted, his voice a dry rasp. I've had worse from a malfunctioning kitchen bot. You lie with the inefficiency of a hatchling, she replied, kneeling before him. Her long clawed fingers were surprisingly gentle as she took the medical patch from his clumsy hands and applied it with surgical precision. Your vitals are stabilizing, but your neural pathways are still glowing. You touch the ancient mind, Elias. You should be vaped. Instead, you are just tired. Humans are stubborn, remember? Elias looked around the bay. The 300 refugees were no longer huddled in terror. Under the guidance of the woman he had noticed earlier, a former colony teacher named Sarah, they were beginning to organize. They were sharing the meager rations Elias had brought, tending to each other's stasis burns, and speaking in hushed, wonder-filled tones about the golden light. The Great Hunger was now a great shield. The station's automated defenses were no longer targeting the refugees. They were forming a perimeter around the bay, rebuffing any attempts by the Void Cell's remaining loyalists to breach the sector. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, stepping toward Elias. She was holding her small child, whose wide eyes were fixed on Varazul with more curiosity than fear. "The broadcast. We saw it in the pods. We saw what Kalen did. But the rest of the station, the 47 species, they're still out there, and they're still armed." Elias looked at Varazul, then at the viewport where the whispering void churned. "Now we do the hardest thing in the galaxy, Sarah. We talk. The truth is out, but the trust is still foobar. Kalen wanted to build a future on a lie because he didn't think the truth was strong enough to hold us together. We have to prove him wrong." As if punctuated by his words, the bay's primary comlink chirped. It wasn't the encrypted signal of the Void Cell, but the open band frequency of the Silthian collective. "This is High Speaker Mycellus," the voice chattered, the translation rendering the chemical-based language into a frantic, clicking English. "We have received the resonance. We have seen the harvest logs. The collective is horrified. We are withdrawing our support from the Vex Council. We request parley with the human representative and the Xandari defector." Varazul's cilia twitched. Defector, a sharp word for someone who just saved their station. "It's a start," Elias said, a faint smile touching his lips. "It's better than target." Over the next 6 hours, the immediate violence on the station began to ebb. It wasn't a clean stop. There were still skirmishes in the lower sectors, and several Valthari mercenary units had bugged out with whatever loot they could carry. But the major powers, the Silthians, the Krell, and even a faction of the Xandari sovereignty, had pulled back their forces. The evidence of the Void Cell's betrayal was too overwhelming to ignore. The image of 300 humans being used as biological batteries had done what 1,000 treaties could not. It had created a shared sense of revulsion. Elias spent those hours in a haze of diplomatic dispatches and medical checkups. He was no longer the junior liaison that Kalen could ignore. He was the man who had spoken to the Void and made it blink. He found himself standing on a balcony overlooking the central promenade of Sector 1, watching as a joint task force of Krell and human security officers worked together to distribute medical supplies. There was no predatory silence here. There was only the messy, chaotic noise of survival. "I have been thinking about your tea, Elias," Varazul said, appearing at his side as if formed from the shadows themselves. "Yeah? Thinking it was too bitter?" "No, I was thinking about the concept of the ash. You said connection is the only thing that doesn't rust. My sisters in the sovereignty are calling for my head, but the junior hunters, they are asking questions. They want to know how a human survived the resonance. They want to know why a huntress would choose to stand with the prey." "And what did you tell them?" Varazul looked out at the stars, her violet eyes deep and thoughtful. "I told them that the hunt is easy. Anyone can kill. But to sit in the dark and offer a cup of tea, that requires a kind of lethal bravery that the Xandari have never known. I told them that I have found a new prey." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And who's the lucky target?" "The future," she said, her voice dropping into a register of profound sincerity. "I am going to hunt for a way to make this accord hold. Not through a machine, but through the connection you showed me. It is a very long-range mission. High probability of failure." "Sounds like my kind of party," Elias said, leaning his head back against the cold glass. He felt a strange, quiet peace settling over him. The grief for Kalis IV was still there. It would always be there, a dark ember in the center of his chest. But it wasn't a weight anymore. It was a foundation, He realized that Kalen's mistake hadn't just been the cruelty, it had been the belief that human history was a weakness. Kalen thought the ash had to be hidden or harvested. Elias knew that the ash was the only thing that could make the new world grow. Secondary characters from the various delegations began to filter into the promenade below. He saw the Scythian speaker talking to a Krell commander, their body language stiff but no longer aggressive. He saw a group of Valthari traders offering blankets to the human refugees. It was a fragile, beautiful, and terrifying thing to witness. The humanistic paradigm, as the academic drones were already calling it, was being tested in real time. It wasn't about being better than everyone else. It was about being willing to be broken together. "You've changed the math, Elias," a voice whispered. He turned to see High Overseer Kalen, or what was left of him. The man was in a high-security stasis field, being moved toward a transport for trial. He looked diminished, his silver hair unkempt, his eyes hollow. "I did what I had to for our survival," Kalen said, his voice a pathetic wheeze. "You've just ensured we'll all die together when the real dark comes." "Maybe," Elias said, looking the man in the eye without a hint of anger, "but at least we'll be holding hands when it happens. And I think that's a hell of a lot better than being a battery in your basement. Goodbye, Director. I hope you find the silence you were looking for." As Kalen was led away, Elias felt the final tether to his old life snap. He wasn't the man from the parlor anymore. He wasn't the man who hid in books. He was a survivor who had found his voice. "Zul," Elias said, looking at the huntress. "Yes, Elias. Do you think they have chamomile on Kepler 452? Vara Zul tilted her head, her cilia pulsing with what Elias had come to recognize as a Xandari laugh, a series of high-frequency clicks. "If they do not, we will plant it. I am told I have a very efficient grip for gardening. Let's get out of here, Zul. I think I've had enough of this station for one lifetime." They turned away from the viewport, leaving the golden light of the core behind. They were moving toward a future that had no schematics, no treaties, and no guarantees. But as they walked through the ruined corridors of the Ocularis Nexus, their hands brushed against each other, a human of ash and a huntress of light, walking together into the great unknown void. 3 months had passed since the great hunger had been silenced, and the Ocularis Nexus had been transformed from a diplomatic powder keg into the administrative heart of the new Andromeda Convergence. The station was still under repair, its hull scarred by the battles of the Shattered Accord. But the atmosphere inside had changed fundamentally. The predatory silence had been replaced by a bustling polyphonic chaos that smelled less like ozone and more like 1,000 different homeworlds. Elias Thorne stood in the center of the newly renamed Sanctuary Gardens in Sector 1. He was no longer dressed in the stiff, soot-stained suit of a junior diplomat. He wore a simple, durable vest of Terran weave and a pair of boots that had seen heavy use in the dirt of the new settlements. He was 40 years old now, at least according to the Terran calendar, though the stress of the last year made his bones feel as if they had lived for a century. In front of him stood a small rectangular plot of soil, painstakingly transported from the hydroponics bay. It was the first unregulated garden on the station, a space where any species could plant a memory from their home. Elias knelt in the dirt, his fingers, calloused and steady, carefully pressing a small, dried seed into the earth. It was a jasmine seed, saved from the very tea he had shared with Vara Zul in the room where everyone else had fled. "You are planting things that have no tactical value again," a voice boomed behind him. Elias didn't look up. He smiled as he patted the soil down. "Tactical value is overrated, Zul. This is about roots, something my people are finally rediscovering." Vara Zul stepped into the light of the artificial suns. She looked different, too. She no longer wore armor of any kind, her iridescent teal skin decorated with the silver markings of a mediator, a role she had carved out for herself among the Xandari who had chosen to stay on the station. Her violet eyes were soft, reflecting the green of the budding plants around them. "The Xandari High Command has officially recognized our residency," she said, her voice a warm, harmonic resonance. "They are calling it an observational alliance, a fancy way of saying they are too afraid to kill us and too curious to ignore us." "I'll take a curious over vapt any day of the week," Elias said, standing up and dusting the soil from his knees. He walked to a small table near the edge of the garden. On it sat 2 porcelain cups and a steaming pot of herbal blend. It wasn't the fine ceremonial tea of the high overseers. It was the tea of a man who had dug through ash and found water. "Sit," Elias said, gesturing to the chair. "The first harvest is still a few months away, but I've got some chamomile from the Velonis territories that isn't half bad." Vera Azul sat, her movements still possessing that lethal, predatory grace. But her intent was entirely different. She reached for the cup, her long, clawed fingers wrapping around the delicate porcelain with a gentleness that was now a habit rather than an effort. "I saw Sarah and the child this morning," she said, taking a sip. "They are boarding the transport for the new colony on Kepler 452. The boy, he gave me this." She held up a small, crudely carved piece of wood. It was a bird, a Terran sparrow, recognizable even in its rough form. "He called it a gift for the dragon." Vera Azul clicked softly. "I do not know what a dragon is, but his heart rate was steady when he gave it to me. There was no fear, Elias, only connection. Dragons were the monsters of our legends," Elias explained, his gaze distant. "Big, terrifying creatures that guarded treasures." "I think he got it half right. You're definitely terrifying, Zul, but I think you're guarding something much more important than gold." They sat in silence for a long moment, watching the commuters move through the promenade below. Humans, Xandari, Silthians, and Krell, were intermingling in a way that would have been unthinkable just a year ago. There were still arguments. 47 species would never agree on everything, but the arguments were happening over trade rates and housing allocations, not over who had the right to exist. Elias looked at his hands. They were no longer the hands of a man who was waiting for the end. They were the hands of a man who was building a beginning. He thought back to the tea room on Meridian Prime. He thought about the moment Vera Azul had entered, and the instinctual, bone-deep terror that had made everyone else flee. He had stayed because he was empty. He had stayed because he had lost his world and thought he had nothing left to lose. But he had been wrong. He had everything to gain. "I spent the better part of 15 years thinking that the ash of Kalis 4 was my final chapter. I carried that grief like a shield, a cold weight that I used to keep the universe at a distance because I didn't want to be hurt again. I thought that by being empty, I was safe. I thought that by staying quiet in the back of the room, I could avoid the hunger of the void. But standing in the center of that machine, with Zul's hand on my shoulder, I realized that humanity isn't defined by what we lose. We're defined by what we do with the pieces that are left. We're a species of survivors, yes, but we're also a species of builders. We take the broken shards of our history, the soot of our failures, and the illogical, stubborn hope of our hearts, and we weave them into something that can actually hold back the dark. Trust isn't a calculation. It's not an equation where you wait for the probability to be in your favor. It's a choice. It's the decision to sit down and offer a cup of tea to the person who was built to destroy you. It's the realization that connection is the only thing that actually makes life worth the biological effort. I'm not empty anymore. I'm full of the voices of 300 survivors, the click-clack of a huntress's laugh, and the scent of jasmine growing in a place it was never meant to be. We didn't just survive the harvest. We learned how to plant a new one. And this time, we're growing it together. Elias took a final sip of his tea, the warmth settling deep in his chest. He looked at Vera Azul, who was watching a small butterfly, a Terran import, fluttering around the jasmine sprout. The huntress looked at the fragile creature with a wonder that was purely and beautifully illogical. "Zul," Elias said, his voice soft. "Yes, Elias. I was just wondering something." He leaned back, looking out past the garden, past the station's rings, and into the vast, infinite tapestry of the stars. The whispering void was still out there, as deep and dangerous as ever. But it didn't look like a mouth anymore. It looked like a canvas. I spent years carrying that anger like armor, only to realize it was a prison. I've seen species across this galaxy do the same, building walls out of their past pains and their fears of the other. It almost cost us everything. I wonder, is there a memory or a resentment in your own life that you've been holding on to like a shield? What would happen if you finally set it down and just offered a seat to the person you're most afraid of. Verazul didn't answer with words. She simply reached across the table and placed the carved wooden bird next to the teapot. Elias smiled, picked up the watering can, and began to tend to the small green sprout in the dirt. Somewhere in the deep silence of the station, the jasmine began to bloom.